In the winter of 897, something truly unbelievable happened in Rome. In the grand halls of St. Peter's Basilica, a corpse was dug up, dressed in full papal robes, and placed on a throne to stand trial. The accused was a pope named Formosus, who had died nearly a year earlier. The man who ordered this grotesque spectacle was Pope Stephen VI, and what followed would go down in history as one of the most surreal and disturbing episodes in the history of the Church. The Cadaver Synod. Now, this isn't medieval legend or myth, this really happened. A dead pope was put on trial, his crimes read aloud, and a verdict delivered to his lifeless body. The corpse was even appointed a deacon to speak on its behalf. But why? What drove the Church to such madness? And what does this strange event say about the state of the papacy in the 9th century? To truly understand the Cadaver Synod, we need to look beyond the spectacle, to the tangled politics, rival empires, and deep-rooted power struggles that were tearing Rome apart. To understand why Pope Formosus was dug up and dragged into court, we need to understand who he was and why so many people hated him. Formosus was born around 816, likely in central Italy, and rose through the ranks of the church as a talented diplomat and clergyman. In 864, he was appointed Bishop of Porto, one of the suburbicarian sees around Rome, and quickly made a name for himself as a skilled negotiator. In 866, Formosus's reputation as a capable churchman earned him a high-profile assignment. He was sent as a papal legate to Bulgaria, representing the Pope in a region that had only recently embraced Christianity. Now this was a big deal, and Formosus rose to the occasion. He proved to be an effective diplomat and religious leader, winning the respect of Boris I, the ruler of Bulgaria. In fact, Boris was so impressed that he asked Pope Nicholas I to make Formosus the Archbishop of Bulgaria, a major show of confidence and a rare request coming from a foreign court. But Pope Nicholas had said no. It wasn't personal. The Pope was sticking to church law, specifically a rule laid down by the Second Council of Nicaea, where bishops weren't allowed to jump dioceses or hold more than one office. Since Formosus was already the Bishop of Porto, taking up the post in Bulgaria would have broken that rule. The church had been burned before by overly ambitious bishops, and Pope Nicholas didn't want to set a precedent that could lead to power grabs or rival fiefdoms within the church. Even so, the episode shows just how respected Formosus had become, and his diplomatic work didn't stop there. He traveled to other key centers of power, including Constantinople, at the heart of the Byzantine Empire, and to the Carolingian court, where he crossed paths with Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish noble with big ambitions in Italy. These encounters placed Formosus at the center of some of the biggest political and religious currents of the day, and cemented his role as one of the most influential church figures of the 9th century. By the 860s, Formosus was a rising star in the church and increasingly influential within Rome itself. But influence in 9th century Rome was a dangerous thing. The papacy at this time was a political prize, constantly caught in the tug-of-war between Roman noble families, foreign powers, and ambitious clergy. And soon, Formosus found himself right in the middle of all of that. During the reign of Pope John VIII, which was 872 to 882, Formosus's fortunes took a sharp downturn. Relations between the two soured, and John began to see him not as an ally but a threat. Some sources suggest that Formosus may have supported a rival claim to the papacy, possibly one of the Carolingian princes, or at least positioned himself as a candidate for future succession, something that John VIII saw as dangerously presumptuous. This wasn't just political jockeying, it was insubordination. In 872, John VIII took decisive action. He excommunicated Formosus, accusing him of abandoning his post as Bishop of Porto, of harboring ambitions for the papal throne, and of sowing discord both inside and outside the church. He also charged him with leaving his diocese without permission and forming alliances with foreign enemies of Rome, an especially serious claim in a city where spiritual authority and military power were tightly intertwined. The sentence was severe, and Formosus was not only excommunicated, but he was stripped of his title and forbidden from performing Mass. Forced into exile, Formosus fled Rome and disappeared from the public eye for several years. But as was often the case in medieval politics, things didn't stay settled for very long. The Pope's power was always fragile, and Rome was a city where alliances shifted like the wind. After Pope John VIII was assassinated in 882, allegedly by his own inner circle, Formosus's fortunes turned again. Under Pope Marinus I, who reigned briefly from 882 to 884, Formosus was rehabilitated. His excommunication was lifted, and he was restored as his former role as Bishop of Porto. It was a quiet return at first, but Formosus had not been forgotten. His name still carried weight, and in the years that followed, he remained an influential figure behind the scenes. Then, in 891, opportunity came knocking for him. After years of turbulence, Formosus was elected Pope of Rome. It was a dramatic turnaround, from excommunicated outcast to the most powerful cleric in the land. But if Formosus had hoped for peace, he was in for a very rude awakening. Almost immediately, he was pulled into the middle of a bitter conflict between two powerful factions vying for control of Italy and the papacy itself. On one side stood Arnulf of Carinthia, a Carolingian prince and king of East Francia, whom Formosus saw as a legitimate and stabilizing force. On the other side was the entrenched Spoletan dynasty, led by Guy III of Spoleto, and later his son Lambert, an ambitious Italian noble family with strong ties to the Roman aristocracy and their own designs on imperial power. Formosus viewed the Spoletans as dangerous usurpers and sought to break their grip on central Italy. In a very bold move, he invited Arnulf to cross the Alps and invade Italy, hoping to install him as a pro-Frankish counterweight to Spoleto's dominance. Arnulf responded, leading a successful campaign and eventually capturing Rome. In 896, Formosus crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor, a clear rebuke to Lambert of Spoleto, who still claimed the title for himself. It was a high-stakes gamble. Formosus had aligned himself with a foreign military power in hopes of restoring order and asserting the papacy's independence from Roman noble families. But the gamble didn't pay off for long. Soon after his coronation, Arnulf suffered a stroke and was forced to return north, leaving Rome vulnerable once again. The Spoletans quickly moved to reassert their influence, and Formosus, physically frail and politically isolated, unfortunately died in April of 896, just weeks after the coronation. To his supporters, he died a reformer, a statesman, someone who tried to save the papacy from corruption and domination by local warlords. To his enemies, particularly the Spoletans, he was a traitor and a meddler who had sold out Rome to foreign powers. And for some, his death wasn't enough. When Formosus died in April of 896, the city of Rome was once again left in a state of political uncertainty, and with it, the papacy. His immediate successor, Pope Boniface VI, lasted barely 2 weeks. Some sources say he died of gout, others suggest he was forcibly removed or assassinated, possibly at the hands of the Spoletans, who were eager to reclaim control over the papal throne. Into this volatile environment stepped Stephen VI. Stephen was a bishop from Anagni, a town southeast of Rome, and had previously been appointed to the bishopric of Rome, possibly by Formosus himself, but he was also deeply tied to the powerful Spoletan dynasty, the very faction Formosus had tried to undermine. Whether Stephen had long held resentment toward Formosus, or simply acted out of political necessity, one thing is clear. He owed his position to the Spoletans, and they expected him to act accordingly. At the time, Lambert of Spoleto, son of the late Guy III, still claimed the imperial crown that Formosus had handed to Arnulf of Carinthia. Though Arnulf had briefly succeeded in capturing Rome, his sudden illness and retreat had left a power vacuum behind, and Lambert was ready to fill it. Stephen VI's papacy became a political tool for Lambert and his allies. They didn't want to just reverse Formosus's policies, they wanted to erase him completely, to invalidate everything he had done, and most importantly, to delegitimize Arnulf's imperial coronation. To do that, it wasn't enough to criticize Formosus's decisions. They decided to put him on trial. It was a grotesque solution to a political problem. Formosus had been buried for nearly 9 months at this point. But Stephen VI, either under pressure from Lambert or driven by his own ambition, agreed to the plan. A formal ecclesiastical synod was convened. But instead of debating doctrine or disciplining living clergy, this synod would do something Rome has never seen before and hoped to never see again. They would dig up the Pope's corpse and put it on trial and destroy his legacy in front of the entire church. It was early 897, just months after Pope Stephen VI had taken office. The scene was St. Peter's Basilica, the holiest church in Christendom, and it was transformed into something between a courtroom, a theater, and a tomb. At the center of it all sat a corpse. The body of Pope Formosus, dead for nearly a year, had been exhumed from his grave, dressed in full papal vestments, and propped up on a throne to face trial. His decayed hands were carefully posed. His rotting face, barely held together, was framed by the tiara of his former office. A deacon was appointed to speak on his behalf, answering questions posed to the lifeless figure before a panel of bishops and clergy summoned by Pope Stephen VI. This was no ordinary trial. The charges were serious, if politically transparent. Stephen accused Formosus of violating canon law by becoming pope while still serving as Bishop of Porto, perjury, and illegitimately claiming the papacy. All of these accusations stemmed from canon law, particularly the rule that a bishop should not move from one diocese to another. But everyone present knew the deeper reason. This was about revenge, humiliation, and the total destruction of Formosus' influence. By proving that Formosus had never been a legitimate pope, Stephen could undo his ordinations, nullify his political acts, and restore the reputation of the Spolitan dynasty. Stephen presided over the trial with visible fury. According to later accounts, the Pope shouted accusations at the corpse, sometimes even grabbing and shaking it. The grotesque spectacle shocked even those accustomed to violence and chaos in Rome. At the end of the farcical proceedings, the verdict was never in doubt. Formosus was found guilty. The corpse was stripped of its papal robes, the 3 fingers that he would have used to deliver blessings were cut off of the body, and his body was dragged through the streets of Rome. He was first buried in a pauper's grave, and then dug up again, tied to weights, and thrown into the Tiber River. Stephen had made his statement, but he'd also crossed a line that even horrified his own supporters. For a brief moment, Pope Stephen VI had done exactly what he set out to do. He had publicly humiliated Formosus, erased his legacy, and appeased the powerful Spolitan faction. But it did not last. The grotesque nature of the Cadaver Synod had stunned not only Rome, but the wider Christian world. Even in an age of brutal politics and violent factionalism, parading a decaying corpse through a courtroom struck many as sacrilegious, an act not of justice but of madness. The Roman people, already weary of political instability and noble interference in church affairs, turned against Stephen. Riots broke out in the streets. His allies all abandoned him. And just a few months after the Synod, Stephen VI was imprisoned. In August of 897, he was strangled to death in his own cell, a grim end that mirrored the chaos that he had unleashed. With Stephen gone, the papacy entered yet another period of rapid turnover. But there was a clear effort to restore dignity and order to the office. Later that same year, Pope Theodore II, whose reign only lasted about 20 days, issued a decree nullifying the Cadaver Synod and restoring Formosus' reputation. Miraculously, Formosus' body had been retrieved from the Tiber River, possibly by monks, and Theodore ordered it reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. His successor, Pope John IX, went further. He convened a new synod that formally condemned the Cadaver Synod, forbade any future trials of the dead, and reaffirmed the validity of Formosus' acts while he was pope. But the controversy wasn't quite over. In 904, another pope, Sergius III, rose to power. A former supporter of Stephen VI, Sergius would reverse the rehabilitation, declare Formosus' papacy invalid once again, and restore the verdict of the Cadaver Synod. The church, it seemed, was still caught in the grip of the same political vendettas that had torn it apart in Formosus' time. Still, in the centuries that followed, the Cadaver Synod came to be seen less as an act of justice and more as a cautionary tale, a symbol of just how far the medieval papacy had strayed from its spiritual mission when power and vengeance became its guiding forces. The Cadaver Synod feels like something out of a dark satire, but it really happened. In the heart of Christendom, a dead pope was put on trial, his corpse condemned, and his legacy nearly erased, all because of politics, grudges, and power struggles that outlived him. Formosus couldn't speak at his own trial, but history has spoken for him. His name is endured, his enemies fell, and the Cadaver Synod remains, to this day, one of the strangest and most haunting episodes in the entire history of the papacy.